This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream and Nebula. Well, after 3 months of shooting, we finally wrapped production on the season finale. And now, as we enter the post-production part of the process, I wanted to share some stuff I've been thinking about over the summer. See, the thing about the season finale is that this is not like a regular video. This is not a video essay. It's entirely narrative, it's much longer than a regular video, on a bigger scale, and obviously it won't be on YouTube. It'll be on Nebula. So for this, we're jumping over to a different platform and sort of a different medium. And as we've been working on it, there's something I've been trying to accomplish. See, I don't want this to feel like a YouTube video. I want this thing to feel like a movie. In other words, I want it to feel cinematic. But what does that actually mean? Is cinematic as simple as being like a movie? But like what movie? Are all movies inherently cinematic just by nature of being movies? I don't think it's that simple. Even back in 1964, writers like John C. Kelly were trying to figure out the meaning of the term. In an essay titled simply Cinematic, he writes, "Cinematic is a portmanteau word with a multiple and complicated meaning so that, even if it is used among cognoscenti, it is hard to be sure that speaker and listener have the same facet of meaning in mind." The more I thought about this, the more vague it all became. Like right now, Warner Media is hiring a cinematic director for its video game studio Monolith Productions, which requires that applicants have, and I quote, "cinematic skills, cinematic fundamentals, and be well-versed in cinematic presentation skills." I feel like I've said the word cinematic so many times that it's lost all meaning.
I've said Jiminy Jilliker so many times the words have lost all meaning.
So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna try to figure out what the hell cinematic actually means, if anything. Okay, if I'm being honest, this is actually something I started thinking about a few years ago. Like a lot of filmmakers, I sometimes watch YouTube videos about cameras or lenses or filmmaking techniques, hoping to maybe pick up some good ideas or tricks. And if you spend any time in that corner of YouTube, you will encounter thousands upon thousands of videos about how to make your footage, you guessed it,
more cinematic.
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 Cinematic. Cinematic. Cinematic.
Cinematic.
Cinematic. Cinematic. Cinematic.
Cinematic.
Getting a cinematic look.
Now, I've watched a lot of these videos, and it seems to me that their definition of cinematic comes down to a specific collection of elements. These elements are shallow depth of field, smooth camera movements on a gimbal, slow motion, drone shots, black bars at the top and bottom so it looks like an anamorphic frame, and color grading with low-key lighting. Kinda like I have here right now. But the thing is, these videos self-described as cinematic have very little to do with actual traditional cinema. They're really just imitating Peter McKinnon videos. On YouTube, cinematic is just an aesthetic. These elements are being used more for travel videos or wedding videos than anything resembling classic narrative film. And sure, some of these elements appear in mainstream studio movies, but they aren't serving the same narrative function as they are in these videos. So how did we get here? How did cinematic turn into this surface level style? Well, it mostly has to do with the evolution of video technology over the past couple decades. We all start watching movies at a very early age, and even though the general look of movies has changed dramatically from the silent era to the 1950s to today, we all have this collective shared image of what a movie is supposed to look like. Just from consuming movies during our lifetimes, we all develop these subconscious triggers that most people probably can't even describe, but they tell us that we're looking at a real movie. It's like Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart said about pornography. I know it when I see it. So these triggers are little things like the frame rate of 24 frames per second, or a subtle edge light hitting the back of an actor's head. Little things that separate a real movie from, like, a home video. So speaking as a filmmaker who came of age in the 21st century, my relationship with the concept of cinematic has been hugely impacted by evolving technology. We all know how movies are supposed to look, but for most of the time the medium of cinema has existed, that look could not be achieved unless you had serious financial backing to afford film cameras and a proper crew and all that stuff. So us no-budget independent people had to struggle to do the best we could with what we had. When I started making movies, I was using a camcorder that shot on mini DV tapes, and the footage wasn't anything close to what real movies looked like. It only shot in 30 frames per second, not 24, so immediately the whole feeling was off. The dynamic range was terrible, the resolution was only 480p, and worst of all, the aspect ratio was 4:3. And yes, that square aspect ratio, known as the Academy ratio, was how all movies looked until the early 50s with the development of Cinerama. But in the decades since then, that square picture had become mostly associated with television. Our collective image of a real movie was widescreen. Widescreen was cinematic. So the best I could do was turn on the setting that added black bars to the top and bottom of the footage so it looked like it was widescreen, even if it wasn't really. And over the next several years, new developments in video technology got me closer and closer to the goal of what a real movie looked like. In college, I got to use some better camcorders that shot in 24 frames per second in actual widescreen, not 2.35:1 CinemaScope, but, 16:9, which felt huge at the time. And then came DSLRs, which finally gave us that shallow depth of field that we had craved for so many years. Now, ignoring the fact that Citizen Kane, literally the most celebrated movie in Western cinema, was famous for its deep focus, something all our shitty camcorders could already do, we knew that real movies had that out-of-focus background. And now, we could finally do it. As time went on, better sensors on cameras gave better dynamic range, gimbals offered a low-cost way to achieve the look of expensive Steadicams, and with drones, finally, we could have those soaring helicopter shots without having to pay for a helicopter. Now, I should mention that yes, we want better tools to make more visually pleasing images, but I think the truth is that mostly we're all chasing this idea of what we think cinema is supposed to look like, even if it can look like a lot of different things. Even as digital cinema cameras have become the industry standard for movies and TV, most of them are just striving to reproduce the look of 35mm film cameras, because we've been conditioned to think that's how movies are supposed to look. And the times that filmmakers have pushed outside of that have had somewhat mixed results. When Peter Jackson released The Hobbit in 48 frames per second, a totally different frame rate from what all movies have used for 100 years, people lost their fucking minds. They did not like it. And Michael Mann's use of digital cinematography on Miami Vice and Public Enemies, full of deep focus and digital grain with barely any traditional film lighting to be seen, divided audiences, with many people turned off because it just didn't look how movies are supposed to look. And on the opposite end of things, this has proved really effective for a lot of horror movies. A lot of the power of found footage movies, at least the good ones, comes from the lack of traditional cinematic artifice. And going further back, part of why the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is so unsettling is that it didn't look like people were used to movies looking at the time. It looks almost like a weird snuff film and takes away the comforting polish and slickness of a regular Hollywood movie. Okay, so is cinematic really just an aesthetic thing? Well, no matter how many YouTube videos tell you you can make something cinematic in a few easy steps, no, it's not. In her book, The Witch's Flight, The Cinematic, The Black Femme, and the Image of Common Sense, Kara Keeling proposes that pretty much all people, having watched a lot of movies in our lives, have processed film grammar and language to an extent that we view the world in relation to film. And so, cinematic becomes a feeling that can apply to pretty much anything. She writes, processes of cinematic perception enable us to consume cinematic images wherever and however such images are found. Cinematic perception is not confined to interactions with moving image media such as film and television. Involved in the production and reproduction of social reality itself, these perceptual and cognitive processes work to order, orchestrate, produce, and reproduce social reality and sociality. Neither cinematic perceptual schemas nor cinematic matter precedes the other. Together, they constitute the cinematic, an assemblage that might also be referred to as 20th century reality, because we neither posit nor access reality except via these processes which were perfected by film. So basically, we've all had those moments in our lives when we realize that what we're experiencing just feels cinematic. So purely hypothetically, as an example, imagine you're sitting at a restaurant with your girlfriend, and you're talking, and suddenly you realize that she's breaking up with you. And then, on the restaurant speakers, let's say The Scientist by Coldplay starts playing, and then it starts raining outside. So why is that cinematic? And yes, this is heavy-handed as hell, but I'm illustrating a point. So this feels cinematic because you have an emotional story being told in dialogue, and then a music cue and an environmental and lighting change to underline the mood of the scene. These are all cinematic elements working together, visuals and sound telling a story. You could probably remove the dialogue, and it would still be clear what's happening. And we've all developed this shared understanding of these cinematic elements, so we can recognize a moment like that as, yeah, cinematic. Okay, so cinematic is, I believe, a quality that comes from effectively using the tools of cinema to tell a story or express an idea in a way that would not be possible in another medium. I think. I mean, that's my best shot at it. Here's how film scholar Deborah Jaramillo explains it. She writes, a cinematic movie is one that requires a theatrical viewing in order to extract every ounce of visual and oral depth from it. The term is reserved for films that reveal the exploitation of filmmaking technologies in the service of skill and creative vision. I think what can help us understand what makes something cinematic is to look at what makes things uncinematic. Alfred Hitchcock's movie Rope, which is all designed to be one long shot, like 70 years before 1917 did it, is a pretty good movie. But Hitchcock himself criticized it, saying, quote, "It wasn't actually very cinematic. It was really an extension of theater. It was like giving the audience opera glasses, all of them, and letting them follow the characters around." So basically, his choice to not use one of the most essential elements of cinema, editing, made it less like cinema and more like a play. In 2015, film critic Matt Zoller Seitz made a video essay exploring the idea of cinematic TV, which, let me tell you, is a hot button issue in the world of television studies. He talks about how most television directing, even now, is mostly a matter of covering what is happening from as many angles as possible, which usually means a lot of close-ups, to deliver the plot as efficiently as possible, mostly expressed by dialogue, not visuals. Now, not to pick on J.J. Abrams, well, okay, it's always good to pick on him a bit, but one of the common knocks on his first movie, Mission Impossible 3, is that too much of the movie is shot in tight close-ups, a habit left over from Abrams' years of directing television. Cinematic should, theoretically, be something to aspire to. It should justify your choice of medium. If you're gonna make a movie, cool, embrace that. Tell the story visually, not just with close-ups of actors saying dialogue. What Hitchcock called, quote, the uncinematic habit of relying too much on dialogue. As Seitz argues in his video essay, cinematic means the shots have a greater purpose beyond just conveying information or showing who is speaking. As he puts it,
The shots told stories. They also made comments. They didn't just deliver information. They had purpose. They had beauty. They had a soul.
This is what actually matters, more than how shallow your depth of field is, or how high the camera's resolution, or how smoothly the camera moves. It's why, as inspiration for shooting the season finale, I find myself returning over and over again to Steven Soderbergh's Ocean's trilogy. These movies ignore a lot of the common cinematic aesthetics. A lot of the time, they're only lit with whatever lights were in the room when they got there. So scenes will be totally orange or yellow with blown out highlights, but that doesn't matter because they're so cinematic. The visual storytelling is never predictable or formulaic. Beyond just the good scripts, half the fun of these movies is seeing how Soderbergh chooses to present each scene, whether through the framing of shots, what's in or out of the frame, his use of zoom lenses, freeze frames, the use of color, the editing rhythms. These feel like films that fully embrace their medium, that are excited about all the possible ways cinema allows these stories to be told. And that, to me, is cinematic. So getting back to my own work, what have I been doing to actually make the season finale feel cinematic? Well, cards on the table, I fully admit I'm using some of those YouTube tricks. I'm shooting it in CinemaScope 2.35:1, the aspect ratio most associated with cinema, since I want this to feel different from my YouTube videos, which are all 16:9. I've got a professional colorist doing a color grade on it, Ryan, who's actually editing this video you're watching now. And yeah, we're adding a little bit of film grain. We've got drone shots. As much as I recognize that this might be silly, I admit I am still chasing that collective idea of what a real movie looks like. But those were all simple choices I made before we started. During the production, I've been trying to be more thoughtful about the frame. I've tried to pull back and frame shots wider and let them last longer. I tried to be more selective about camera movement when I used it to reveal things or to add energy to a scene. Basically, I tried to be more deliberate about the visual storytelling, instead of shooting a ton of coverage and figuring it all out in the edit. I want to know the purpose of each shot while I'm shooting it. And of course, because this project is so big, yet our resources are so limited, like sometimes I'm the only crew member on set and I also have to act in a scene, so I can't always go as far as I would like. But it's a start. And next time, we'll go further. So thank you for sitting patiently while I sat here and mused about a word that means a lot of different things to different people. Or maybe it doesn't mean anything at all. I don't know. Words are all just made up. And yes, I see the irony in that this video is so uncinematic. It's just me delivering an essay to the camera, so you don't have to point it out in the comments. Now, if you want to see the results of my attempt to make something cinematic, obviously, you've gotta sign up for Nebula. I know we said back in May that the season finale was going to be 20 minutes long and be out in a month, and now it's the end of the summer, but I promise you that it took this long because it turned out to be much, much bigger and more ambitious than we realized. I have spent the entire summer working on this thing, and I gotta say, I think it's gonna be worth the wait. This whole project would not be possible without Nebula, the streaming platform that I helped develop along with a lot of the best people on YouTube. Nebula has given us the budget and resources to make something so much bigger than we ever could on YouTube. And this is just one of many great exclusive Nebula productions. So while you wait for the finale, there's so much there for you to enjoy. And because they love everything we're doing with Nebula, CuriosityStream, the great streaming service dedicated to documentaries, has partnered up with us and we've created a bundle. So if you sign up for CuriosityStream, you also get a Nebula subscription totally free. That's 2 streaming services for the price of 1, and it's cheap. And CuriosityStream has documentaries about everything. Like I was just on a little trip to Bermuda in the middle of the ocean, and you know what? They've got documentaries about the ocean, like Deep Ocean, narrated by David Attenborough. Signing up for this helps support not just this channel, but this whole community of creators, and this place that we're building where we can make the kind of projects that aren't possible on YouTube. So if you want, sign up at the link in the description or go to curiositystream.com/Patrick H. Willems. Oh, and also, Nebula was nominated for a Streamy Award, so you know it's good. Okay, I'm gonna get back to editing the finale. Got a lot of work to do. I'll be back soon.
I love Charles.
It's all coming together.